Thanks for joining me on the Listen Up Girl podcast. I'm your host, Zach Randles-Friedman, and we have a special report today on Easter Sunday. Happy Easter if you celebrate it, and if you don't, happy Sunday. So let's get into it because today's story is not just political, it's personal for a lot of people. And it's one that honestly hasn't been talked about enough in a way it should be. We're talking about Pam Bondi. Her time as Attorney General under the orange convicted felon, and what many critics and many LGBTQ plus Americans are calling one of the most aggressive federal campaigns against queer rights in recent history. This is about policy, this is about power, and this is about real people whose lives were directly impacted. So let me break it down for you. Pam Bondi's tenure as Attorney U.S. General lasted less than 14 months. But in that short window, she managed to leave a very long shadow. Because according to critics, advocates, and even medical professionals, Bondi didn't just oversee the Justice Department, she weaponized it, especially against LGBTQ plus Americans and especially against transgender youth. And when you look at that pattern, not just one action, but many, it starts to tell a much bigger story. So let's start here because this was central. She was targeting trans youth. One of the biggest forces on Bondi's Justice Department was targeting these transgender kids, not adults, not abstract policy debates, kids. Her department launched investigations into school athletics, specifically going after schools and states that allowed transgender girls to compete in sports aligned with their gender identity. And they framed this under Title IX. Now, on paper, this might sound like a legal argument, but in practice, it meant schools, teachers, and students were suddenly under federal scrutiny just for trying to create inclusive environments. And let's be real for a second. We're talking about kids who are already navigating identity, bullying, mental health, and acceptance, and now being pulled into national political battles. There's a healthcare crackdown, but it didn't stop at schools. This is where things got even more serious. Under Bondi, the Justice Department issued subpoenas to hospitals and clinics that provide gender-affirming care to minors. So let me repeat that. They demanded sensitive medical records from doctors, from healthcare systems, from telehealth providers like QueerDoc, and critics warned immediately this wasn't just oversight. This had been the potential to violate patient privacy, scare providers into shutting down services, and even open the door to something much darker, like tracking or registering transgender patients. And here's the impact. Some health systems actually scaled back or completely halted gender-affirming care for minors, including major institutions like the University of Michigan. This wasn't something that we're just making up. This has disrupted real treatment for real families in real time. Imagine being a parent, finally finding care for your child, and suddenly it's gone, not because of medicine, but because of politics. It's a legal warfare. Bondi's Department of Justice also took legal action against states that supported LGBTQ plus inclusion. They filed lawsuits against states that allowed transgender youth to participate in sports. They withdrew support from incarcerated individuals seeking gender-affirming care. They backed restrictions on transgender military service. And they even filed complaints against judges who challenged those policies. And what we are seeing here is not one isolated issue. It's a coordinated legal strategy. It's a pattern. And whether you agree with the policies or not, it's undeniable that LGBTQ plus rights were a central target. So let's talk about the symbolism and erasure. First, symbolism, because that matters too. Under Bondi, the Justice Department supported restrictions on which flags could be displayed at federal sites, and that included the removal of pride flags. From places like the Stonewall National Monument, which is all about pride and LGBTQ plus rights, let that sink in. Stonewall, one of the most important historic sites in LGBTQ history, and even there, pride was removed. That's not just policy, that's messaging. That's saying something about who is seen and who isn't. Then the broader agenda. Bondi also aligned with the broader efforts from the Orange Convicted Felons Administration to reshape narratives around January 6th, civil rights, and American history. And again, this connects. because LGBTQ plus rights don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a larger conversation about whose stories are told, whose rights are protected, and whose identities are violated. Next, you have press and prosecution. These were also controversial moves involving the media. Bondi's Department of Justice repeatedly explored charges against journalist Don Lemon, a high-profile openly gay broadcaster. Now, the charges did not immediately stick, but eventually a grand jury indictment was secured. And even the attempt raised serious concerns about the press freedom and whether LGBTQ plus voices and media were being disproportionately targeted. I would say they probably are. Then this didn't start in D.C. Here's one thing. This wasn't new for Pam Bondi. Her record in Florida tells a very similar story. As the Florida's Attorney General, she defended the state's ban on same-sex marriage, supported policies preventing gay people from adopting children, both of which eventually got struck down in court. So this wasn't a shift, it was a continuation of what she was doing and building. And what does this mean? Now let's take a step back, because this is where I want to talk to you directly. You don't have to agree with every aspect of LGBTQ plus policy, but if you're listening to my show, you probably do. But we should all be able to agree on this. Government power matters, and how it's used matters even more. Because when you see investigations into children, subpoenas for medical records, legal pressure on healthcare providers, removal of identity from public spaces, you have to ask, where is the line? And who gets to decide it? What's the human impact? At the center of all this are people, trans kids, families, doctors, communities, people who, for a brief period, found themselves at the center of a federal campaign. And even though Bondi's tenure is over, there are still ripple effects. They're still here. So what's next? Now, there's already conversations about Pam Bondi potentially returning to politics, possibly returning again for Attorney General in Florida. And if this happens, this record is going to follow her. Because whether you view it as leadership or as overreach, it's part of her legacy now. And that's the story, not just of Pam Bondi, but of a moment in time where policy, politics, and identity collided in a very real way. I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was this about protecting values or targeting a community? Because these conversations matter, and they're not going away anytime soon. I love seeing whenever we see these protests happening, we see people pushing back and organizing and advocacy groups getting involved. We need more of that to protect our community. Thank you so much for listening. I will be back tomorrow with more LGBTQ plus news, and have a happy Sunday.